and a warm welcome to all of you who have tuned in from Washington, D.C. I am delighted that you're joining me this morning for a book talk with Dr. Charles Kupchan, who has just published his latest, and it's called Isolationism, A History of America's Efforts to Shield Itself from the World. It is a magisterial book, beautifully written, and it's thought-provoking. So I would encourage all of you to buy it, and there will be a link in our chat function. And buy it not only for yourselves, but as we get nearer to the holidays, for those folks on your list who want more than chocolates, this will inspire them and cause them to think more deeply about the US role in the world. So it's a particular pleasure for me to do this with Charlie. For those of you who don't know Charlie, he is a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, and he is a professor of international affairs at Georgetown University. He's had a lot of senior positions in government, but Charlie succeeded me at the National Security Council as Senior Director for Europe in 2014. And that's why it's really great to be sharing the stage with him. And there was so much interest in the book at GMF that I'm delighted to be joined by two of my wonderful colleagues, Derek Chollet, who's with me here in Washington as Executive Vice President of GMF, and Thomas Kleine-Brockhoff, who runs the Berlin office of GMF and is also part of my executive team. And the three of us are going to explore the themes in Charlie's book. I'm then going to open it up and try to weave in as many of your questions as I can. So please do use the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and I will be keeping an eye on that. But first, Charlie, let me just ask you a broad question that when I finished reading the book and thinking about the argument you made, the overarching point I was left with was your thesis that strategic pullback is coming for the United States. And if you accept that the US is in a period of retrenchment, we can do that either by design or by default. And that we're going to be much better placed if we practice retrenchment by design. So you're arguing that revisiting or rehabilitating isolationism and drawing lessons from that will put us in the best position to manage that retrenchment. Is that a fair summation, or share with us what are the main themes and the takeaways from your book?
Thanks very much, Karen, for the warm introduction, and it's great to be joined by the three of you. I guess I should begin with a disclaimer in the spirit of full disclosure. Derek and Thomas and Karen are good friends of mine, and as a consequence, you're going to have to discount anything good that they say about the book. But more importantly, you're going to have to disregard anything bad that they say, because it's clearly just an effort to establish credibility. So anyway, it's a pleasure to be joined by three good friends and colleagues. And I might add that this is not the shortest book ever written. And as a consequence, you guys actually had to do some homework. So I appreciate that. Maybe I'll answer your question, Karen, by beginning with a short discussion of why I wrote this book and when I began to contemplate it. And it really goes back to the 1990s when I was serving in the National Security Council for the first time. And I really began to sense that in the aftermath of the fall of the Berlin Wall, the United States was to some extent losing interest in the outside world. We saw coverage of foreign affairs in the media plummet. President Clinton was very reluctant to get involved in the Balkans. You had the 1994 midterms, in which Republicans and Democrats start heading in different directions on foreign policy. That then kind of goes into abeyance after September 11, when everybody kind of said, let's go out and get the bad guys. But then the Iraq War and the Afghanistan War don't go so well. And we're kind of back into this mode of, hey, what are we doing? Has the nation overreached? And that's really when I began to burrow into this subject and start saying to myself, you know what? I need to know more about this country before 1941. I need to know more about our role in the world in a way that is the kind of the country's history longue durée, not just Pax Americana. And then Trump gets elected. He says it's America first, going right back to the mantra from 1940. And I'm in the middle of writing this book, and the isolationism, unilateralism, nativism, protectionism, they're all part of American history. So that's kind of what led me to the book. And I have to say that the more I read of our nation's history, the more my head exploded, because it's so alien for people like ourselves who were, basically, I went to grad school during the Cold War. My first teaching job was before the Berlin Wall fell. We have grown up in a breathing tank of Pax Americana, of American exceptionalism means we do everything. But from 1789 until 1941, that was not the case. In fact, from 1789 to 1898, we were aggressive expanders in North America, but went no further. The founders said, do not entangle the nation in the affairs of other states, commerce with everyone, alliances with no one. And after Washington left the scene, successive generations basically abided by that brand of statecraft. And then from 1898 to 1941, we sort of go back and forth, a realist effort to expand under McKinley. Americans don't like it. They don't like being imperial. Then Wilson comes along and tries an idealist brand of internationalism. Guess what? Americans don't like that either. League of Nations rejected. And then the 20s and 30s, we go back to where we were before 1898, which is isolation. Then you get to 1941 and the whole game changes. And American exceptionalism, which had been a justification for staying out of the world to protect the American experiment, becomes a justification for going out in the world and exporting manifest destiny and changing the nation in the American image. And that's really the beginning of the world that all of us have grown up in. And the book basically says that era of robust liberal internationalism seems to be coming to an end. We're going through a terrible pandemic. Americans sense strategic overreach. Many Americans believe that the country's engagement abroad has come at the expense of liberty and prosperity at home. The nativism that was so much a part of isolationism in previous eras is coming back. We have a president who was a not so subtle nativist, right? So all of these parts of the American experience that drove the country to be more isolationist and less geopolitically ambitious prior to 1941, they are rearing their head. A recent opinion poll showed that 3/4 of the American public want out of Afghanistan and Iraq. Another poll from the left-leaning Center for American Progress says only 18% of the American public are liberal internationalists, and the majority are either America firsters or disengagers. So it's for that reason that I think that a retrenchment is coming. Our foreign policy is no longer in sync with political will. Trump understands that. Obama understood it. They both tried to retrench. Obama was blocked in many respects by the Islamic State. Trump has begun to implement retrenchment, but he's made a hash of it because he operates by tweet. He has no diplomatic plan, and he's alienated many of the partners that we need through an America first unilateralism. So I'll end my quick summary by saying that, as you quoted, I'm someone who believes that retrenchment, a pullback, a trimming of the sails is coming. And the key question is, do we do it in a smart way? Do we do it in a reasonable, judicious way? And so what I want the United States to do is to continue to lead in the world, to continue to organize coalitions of like-minded nations to combat the wide range of global challenges. But we need to right-size the nature of our foreign policy so that it enjoys the support of the public. I want the United States to step back, but not to step away. I want to find the middle ground between doing too little, which is what we did prior to 1941, and doing too much, which is where we've been for the past couple of decades. So that's the quick and dirty version of the book. There's a lot of history to back up that long narrative. But I think I'll stop there and leave as much time as possible for our conversation.
Super, thanks, Charlie. And before I turn to Thomas, just one immediate follow-up. You make this argument that we saw isolationism's long run, and then we saw liberal internationalism endure from 1941 through the Obama presidency. And you just talked about how Trump's election and the use even of the term America First just brought you back to 1940. And because you served in the Obama administration, I'm curious if you would say that what President Obama was doing, was that an example of the sort of judicious pullback you're arguing for?
I can't speak for President Obama or get inside his mind. I can tell you that from where I sat, and I'd be interested in what you have to say and what Derek has to say, because you both served in the administration, he did want to right-size American foreign policy. Derek writes about this to some extent in his book. And I think he understood that American exceptionalism had become a justification for doing everything. And he did want to say, we need to set priorities, we need to pick and choose more carefully. I would remind everyone that he ran for re-election on one of his main bumper stickers was, "It's time for nation building here at home." Why are we building schools in Afghanistan when they should be built in Arkansas? I do think he had real trouble implementing that because Afghanistan wouldn't let go. The Islamic State came along. There was a lot of pushback from other people in the administration. And I think we've seen Trump go through the same thing. He wanted to pull out of many parts of the Middle East, and he was overruled by the Pentagon and by the people around him. So what did he do in the end? He basically hung up the phone with President Erdogan and ordered by tweet American troops out of northern Syria because he was frustrated. That's not how this should happen. But it's a sign of a president who is taking the pulse of the electorate, responding to a demand signal, but having a very difficult time implementing. And I think the implementation question is the core issue here. We have to figure out what right sizing means and figure out how to do it.
Okay, super, thanks. I'd love to bring in Thomas now, because the role of the US in the world is obviously important to us Americans, but it also has key consequences for our allies. So Thomas, how does this look from Berlin?
Well, thanks, Karen, and great privilege to be with you, Charlie. I can just picture you, as you have written in the book, writing this book at your kitchen table. Great privilege. So I expected an intellectual journey in this book, and I sure got it. And I've been asked by Karen to look at it from a European perspective. And that's no easy task, because isolationism here is not a key menu when you look into how you would construct a grand strategy for any given country. Europe, too many countries, too small, proximity. My own country, 9 neighbors, no country is dominant, very important point, persistent rivalry, hundreds of years of alliance building, counter-alliance building, and eventually wars. So isolationism is really not a concept that is well known here. And I was actually thinking of who would we think of in Europe who has had an isolationist national strategy. And, I come to maybe islands, Malta, Cyprus, Ireland, but no, they've been part of alliances. You think of Iceland, again, no, NATO member, even though it doesn't have an army. Then you think of challenged small countries, Finland, threatened by a neighbor, or maybe Switzerland, 19th century Switzerland. It's the only thing that came close with Enver Hoxha's Albania, that sort of sealed itself off from Russia, from the Soviet Union, from the West, from the Warsaw Pact. But then again, it had a big alliance, a strong alliance with China. So not even that works to me. And secondly, isolationism from the European sense comes along with the term autarky. And autarky is oftentimes something that is about dominance, a precursor oftentimes to dominance, hegemony, unilateralism, and imperialism. And you do not need to look much further than National Socialism to see that trend line that comes out of that. So isolationism's little sister here is that has strong connections to imperialism is autarky, also very illiberal. And so my first point I guess I want to make is that for Europeans, isolationism is a privilege that we cannot afford or cannot achieve. And when tried, it comes with a lot of nefarious things. But turning to your American story, first of all, I want to say, first of all, it is a story. It is, first of all, you set out to do three things, and you've mentioned them, is write a comprehensive history, repair isolationism's bad rap and reputation, and thirdly, advocate for a more restrained US future grand strategy. I'll come along with you on two of these on this ride. First of all, this is a great history book, an academic book, scholarly, a one-stop shop for all things isolationism. And you've mentioned it. You are out there for the longue durée. That's a term that you mentioned a minute ago and that I read in the book. It's comprehensive, and I think when you say that isolationism is the default setting for the United States in the last 80 years is rather the exception. I think that's a message that's important for Europeans to hear and to learn about. And in some ways, because it's the history of an idea that you present, it reminds me of Walter Russell Mead's Special Providence, where he sets out to create four schools of thought and four camps: Jeffersonians, Hamiltonians, Jacksonians, Wilsonians, highly structured, analytical, and highly enlightening. You do it a little differently. You don't create four schoolmasters or what you do is you create two schools of thought that one can follow through your book, battling it out, and that is isolationism and internationalism, ambitious internationalism. So that's an intellectual joyride for guys like me. So, but then again, you are not just an academic, you're also a think tanker and a former administration officials, and you don't want to just describe things, you want to influence things. So in this book, you want to refurbish the reputation of isolationism and rediscover its strategic advantages. And I sort of get it. That's a pretty big target to rewrite and reframe that history and this rehabilitation. Attractive because it's contrarian, it's up against the mainstream. And in the best case, you actually widen the scope of what is possible in the debate about grand strategy. But in the end, I have to say, at that point, I have my doubts, and that's where my doubts about part of the book, but this point in the book, come from. So my first question here is rehabilitation even possible? And you've mentioned it, Charlie. Isolationism comes with siblings. These siblings are xenophobia, protectionism, nativism. Those are the ones that you mentioned. A couple of others. Autarky is another one. Even if you were able to rehabilitate isolationism, how would you disentangle from the little siblings? And how would you make isolationism a liberal rather than an illiberal concept, given the history and the siblings? And the second point here is you need to do a multi-step dance here. first you establish isolationism as a concept that served the nation well. Then you establish the caveats, which is to say, well, it served it well, but I actually don't mean the interwar period and the passivity that led to World War II. And secondly, I actually don't want to associate it with the goalless incompetence of Donald Trump. And when you've done that, and then in a third step, you say, well, now it's rehabilitated, but actually that's not where I think America should go. It should go somewhere in selective engagement and liberal internationalism light, sort of along the lines where Karen, you just talked a minute ago. So that to me seems a lot of heavy lifting. And my question is that actually necessary? Is it actually necessary to get to the point that you make by rehabilitating the concept of isolationism? Couldn't you just say, we hark back to an age of restraint, or if you don't want to say restraint over the 150 years, you would say pragmatism, because you said in a minute ago, it's pretty aggressive history of acquisition, but just continentally. And by the way, one could do that because isolationism is a term, as one can read in the book, that comes from the 1930s and is ex post applied to the 150 years before that. So the question is does it need all that effort to make the point? Which gets me to my third and last point, which is the one that you and Karen talked about, the coming pullback. Now, you have a few wonderful vocabulary for this. The United States needs to step back without stepping away, do less while still doing enough, the middle ground between running the world and running away from it. I think this whole concept harks back to your idea of a post-1989 overreach that you just a few minutes ago called strategic overreach. I can very well relate to that. I wrote a book last year, thanks for giving me the opportunity for the plug here, that has the very same concept of the post-1989 overreach. I meant it more like a normative overreach in its transformation, but you mean it strategically, bringing means and ends together. And public support into it, but essentially we're talking about the same thing. So I see this book as a contribution to that great debate about the new equilibrium for foreign policy that is needed, not just in America, but in the Western world. And as that, I value it. So in summary, I would say it's a great history book, an eye-opener for Europeans, an important contribution to the debate that, in my view, could have gotten away with a bit of a lesser intellectual payload.
Charlie, Thomas put a lot on the table, and I'm not going to ask you to respond to all of it right now, but I do want to give you the chance for a brief response to what Thomas said.
Sure. I'll just make two quick points. Great comments, Thomas. The first is that it's not surprising to me that the whole concept doesn't resonate with Europeans because it was a uniquely American concept, in part because of geography. The United States did have big oceans around it and small, relatively benign neighbors to the north and south. And the founders therefore said, let's bank on this. Let's go for the natural security that we have. Many countries don't have that option. Your broader point is an extremely important one. And in part, I chose to move down this road of isolationism because I think it's a story that needs to be told. I think it's a story that Americans and other people around the world need to know, because I do believe that it is part of who we are. It's in our DNA. Walter Russell Mead, as you mentioned, calls this the Jacksonian impulse. I think Donald Trump is tapping into some kind of deeper political strain, identity, narrative, that is part of the United States. And I think we need to understand that, and it needs to be out there. The other reason that I wanted to use the word isolationism, and as you've rightly said, it has provoked controversy, is that I think our debate in this country needs to be leavened. And we tend to have a kind of bimodal debate, right? Where they're the liberal internationalists, pedal to the metal, let's run the world. And then there's the restraint school, and everyone says, hey, they're the isolationists, they're dangerous. So what I'm trying to do here is to say, no, let's look at isolationism's benefits and dangers, its good bits and its bad bits. It served the nation well in the 19th century. It was a huge mistake in the 1930s. Internationalism, in my mind, was very good during most of the Cold War. It led us astray afterward. Let's look at the full record, because we need that full record to inform where we go now. On the normative question, I think you and I are probably in the same place. I'm not going to put words in Derek's mouth, but I'm guessing he's not going to fundamentally disagree. And I do think that in a polarized country where Democrats and Republicans disagree, what I'm trying to articulate, doing less but doing enough, does constitute a sweet spot of sorts in the American political system. I think Democrats and Republicans can come together on a brand of internationalism that is still robust, but has been trimmed back. And I think that sounds to me like you and I are in the same place on that. And I see it not just as a question of strategic commitments, but also a normative question, because the overreach has been normative as well as concrete.
Super. Thanks so much, Charlie. Now let's turn to Derek. And Derek, share your perspective.
Sure, thanks. And Charlie, congrats on this terrific book. I actually have a real copy of it. I still believe in buying books, and it's a great read. Thomas, your description of it as an intellectual joyride is a really accurate description. And I have three comments, one shameless plug, and one question. So comment number one, Charlie, I'm really interested in hearing from you more on how you define engagement, because it seems to me in this whole discussion of restraint or retrenchment or retreat, engagement is defined by one principal metric, the use of US military power. And even in the example you cite at the very beginning of the book of Obama's infamous red line, in which you use as a way to indicate of sort of, this is both his reluctance to use force in Syria, as well as Congress's reluctance to take risks in Syria of isolationism. It seems to me that was more of a wise sense of risk calculation in terms of a wariness of getting involved in the Syrian conflict militarily. But then also the result of the Red Line episode, which often gets overlooked or sort of quickly passed over because of the inelegant way it came about, which was the removal, the peaceful removal in an international cooperative effort of 1,300 tons of chemical weapons from Syria that had never been declared before, is not exactly isolationism. It's actually sort of accomplishing a pretty key goal that made the US more secure. Now, it's a separate issue from whether the use of military power should have been used to try to influence the direction of the Syrian civil war. But make no mistake, the use of military power would not have removed 1,300 tons of chemical weapons in Syria. So anyway, it gets to this question of what is really retrenchment other than a wariness of using force like the Middle East. Okay, so that's number one. Number two is just to hear from you more on this connection between America's strength at home and its strength abroad. I mean, on the one hand, it's, and particularly given what we're going through now in the United States, it's sort of obvious and intuitive that America is going to be limited in what it can do abroad if it's weak at home, if it has a weak economy, if it has a political system that's unable to make decisions, if we are, if our public debate is so overtaken by our ills at home that there's no bandwidth to talk about what's really going on in the world. So, you talked about Obama talking about nation building at home. And of course, he was roundly criticized for uttering that phrase. Of course, I wonder from the perspective of today, people looking at what the United States has been through in the last few years and is going through currently, whether folks seriously believe that we would be better off today with less nation building at home during the Obama years. And what we see right now also is a foreign policy debate, particularly on the Democratic side. It's really unclear what's happening on the Republican side on this, but where the middle class is being more front and center. And the question of the idea we need to approach foreign policy debates with an eye of how does this help the American middle class? How does this help everyday people accomplish what they need to improve their everyday lives? I'm wondering if that question, just the fact that question is being raised, should be seen as isolationism. And then third, I see, and I've been struck by this, particularly with President Obama, that a lot of this comes down to pragmatic problem solving. I mean, what's interesting is Obama says, even today, he just said it the other day in an interview, that one of the things that surprised him the most about being president was how the U.S. is the underwriter of the international order. Every country, even our enemies, looks to the United States for answers. That folks don't turn to Moscow or Beijing, as a matter of course, first to find out how to help fix problems. So it's not so much a matter of wanting to dominate the world, of wanting to own every problem, but the idea that the U.S., because of its unique power, because of its influence, because of the values and ideals that it stood for, does bear a certain responsibility. And sometimes that responsibility is difficult to bear. Sometimes it's presidents don't want to necessarily bear it because there's other priorities, but nevertheless, that's the reality. One question is whether, after what we've been going through in the last few years, and particularly if President Trump's reelected, whether that unique position that the U.S. finds itself in would go away, perhaps forever. The shameless plug is I agree completely that there's a sweet spot between whether it's called restraint and liberal internationalism, or maximalism and retrenchment, or whatever. I call it the middle way. It's a hearkening back to Eisenhower. I mean, Dwight Eisenhower, if you read his speeches and you follow his foreign policy, I think Barack Obama fits nicely within that tradition. So even though we absolutely need to renew our foreign policy to make it relevant for the 21st century, I think it's also important for us to remember that some of our finest presidents on foreign policy, presidents like Eisenhower and Bush 41 and Obama, in my opinion, actually had a very similar worldview of pragmatic problem solving that was ambitious about America's role in the world, but also mindful of our limits, and particularly wary of the use of military power. Not that they were unwilling to use it, of course, because they all did, but concerned about where this might lead. And so whether that counts as isolationism or retrenchment or restraint or just being smart is I think worth thinking about. Now, finally, on the question, I just wanted to push you more on something. And you mentioned it at the very beginning of your talk today, and you mentioned it at the end of your book. It's a question of do you think this isolationist backlash that we're currently seeing in the United States, I mean, I'm curious how deep that actually is, and whether it is really reflective of the American people's sentiment. I mean, even the polls you mentioned are really about wariness of the use of military force. And we've seen public opinion polling show that, the value Americans place on alliances, and particularly alliances like NATO, are still quite high. And Trump's rhetoric is not really consonant with where the American people are. And so I guess I just ask, is being wary of military intervention isolationist? And thanks, Charlie. It's a great book. I love it. Highly recommend it to all.
Thank you, Derek.
Charlie, you should definitely answer that.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think that Americans were internationalist from day one, if internationalism means engaged in the world commercially, culturally, problem solving, wanting to spread democracy. And I define very early on isolationism as the willingness to use military force and take on strategic commitments beyond the motherland? That to me is the key question here. And that's how I measure this debate between isolationism, retrench, full-on internationalism is, are we using our blood and treasure in distant lands? And so you may disagree with that definition, but I think that's kind of how I grapple with it. And that's how the founders thought about it, right? In the sense that George Washington in the farewell address said, commerce with everybody, alliances with no one. The founders were intent on expanding to the Pacific coast, but they also said, we're going to go no further because we don't want to entangle ourselves in the affairs of others. So that's the kind of mindset that I think the founders had and that I use throughout the book. And but you're very right to say that there are other forms of international engagement. And I'm someone who believes we should max out on those other forms of international engagement, be they political, cultural, people-to-people, coalition building, whatever it might be. So that just kind of clarifies the nature of the debate. And I see retrenchment in this respect as a middle ground. I think you used the term middle way between the isolationists and the full-on internationalists. It sounds to me like the three of us, and maybe Karen, the four of us, agree that that's where we ought to head. What I'm trying to do is to structure a debate to get us there by looking at the pros and cons of our isolationist past, the pros and cons of our internationalist recent past or present, and trying to say, okay, let's see if we can't finally find that middle course after a long history of either doing too little or doing too much. And I would agree with you, under Eisenhower and others, we probably were pretty close to that middle ground. Final point I would make is on the Obama red line, I wasn't really using that to say think it was a good decision or a bad decision. It was just an arresting moment in American foreign policy, because here was a president who said, if you do X, I will do Y. And he stepped back from that. Now, maybe it was the right thing to do, but it was nonetheless, for me, an indicator that something was changing in the American political discourse and the political system about the use of force. Here was a guy who had just used chemical weapons. The president and Congress were saying, well, maybe we shouldn't react with force. And part of why I put that in the intro is I wanted to say that this is not just about Trump, that Trump is a symptom as much as a cause of this inward turn. And I also think my final comment would be this, Derek. I think that there is a kind of an impulse in the United States. We don't see much of it because we live in the East Coast bubble, but an impulse that does say we should kind of pull ourselves back from the world. And I don't want that to happen. I fear that it could happen. I fear that overreach could turn into underreach. And that's why I'm hoping to help foster a national debate that gets us to pull back, to find that new equilibrium between what we're doing in the world and our political will to sustain those commitments. Because I see that as an inoculation against what we did in the 1930s, which was to stick our head in the sand.
Thanks so much, Charlie. I wanted to pull on something that a point Thomas made, and connect it to a question that has come in. Thomas asked a question about whether it is possible to rehabilitate the concept of isolationism without it bringing along its baggage, its siblings, xenophobia, nativism, autarky. And this question of, can isolationism be a liberal force rather than an illiberal force? And we have a question from Jim Colby, a former member of the House, a fellow here at GMF. And let me read you his question. Why should we think of the last 80 years as an aberration in our foreign policy outlook, rather than an evolution to a more enlightened policy of engagement and leadership? We have a long history of bad race relations, including slavery, that we are struggling to overcome, but no one would suggest that these efforts to overcome racial discrimination is a temporary aberration. Shouldn't we seek to be engaged in a positive way that advances fundamental values of freedom and democracy? What do you think, Charlie?
I think it's a good question, and let's go on to the next one. No. When I say that the last 80 years are an aberration, I meant that literally. That is to say that if you just do the math, from 1789 to 1941 is a lot longer than 1941 to today. So part of what I'm saying here is let's think about American history writ large, because it's, in my mind, important to understanding the nation. And number two, even though I started this book before Trump came into office, I have to say that this has been a sobering 3.5, 4 years for me. And that the nativism, the xenophobia, the racism, the unilateralism, it's kind of shocking to me the degree to which these orientations have found traction among a substantial portion of the American public. The public seems to be tiring of them right now, although I think the pandemic has a lot to do with it. But I do think that we need to see these impulses as being part of the American experience and not dismiss them and say, oh, they're gone, because Trump makes clear that they're not gone. So this book is in part intended to be a warning against allowing those impulses to come back. And coming back to Thomas's first point, some of those impulses are alive and well in Europe. Not the isolationism, but the unilateralism, the desire to cordon off. Boris Johnson seems to have said a few hours ago that they're going to bounce out of the European Union. So something funny is going on here that we need to get our arms around. So again, I'm not saying that I want us to go back to the America that we saw before 1941. But I'm saying it's part of the experience. Let's understand it. Let's manage it. Let's make sure that we don't make the same mistakes that we made previously. Draw on the best traditions of the country's foreign policy over its history.
Charlie, we have another listener, Nora Fisher-Onar, who wants to draw you out on the tension between the isolationist impulse and geopolitical necessity. And she says, there are previous periods of isolationism that happened in the absence of another rising power of global capacity. But how does one retrench selectively in an era when China has come of age?
Well, I'd be interested in having a conversation with the four of you and everyone else about what constitutes smart, judicious retrenchment. For me, it is largely about ending fighting wars of choice in the strategic periphery, particularly land wars. My view is that we can do a lot of what we need to do in the Middle East and other areas outside Eurasia with a light footprint, and generally using standoff military forces to go after, for example, terrorists in Afghanistan. I am not in the camp of the so-called restraint school, that it also means pulling out of Europe and or pulling out of Asia. I think that would be a historic mistake. And to me, the offshore balancing strategy that people like Mearsheimer and Posen and Walt and others call for is a recipe for disappearing, because once we leave, it's very hard to go back. Once we leave and trouble starts to break out, are we really going to want to come rushing back in to put out the fire? I don't know. And so I do think we should maintain our core commitments in the Eurasian heartland. And Nora is right to point out that the rise of China is going to keep the US engaged in Asia, and I agree with that. But I do think that we shouldn't presume that there is an automatic sense that if China is out there, that we're going to man the barricades, because that's not what happened in the 1930s, right? We basically became a passive bystander as Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan carved up Europe and Asia. And I don't think we would do that again, but it's important to keep that history in mind. And it's important to keep in mind that Roosevelt, who is remembered as a great wartime leader, was basically an isolationist until the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor.
And Tomas and Derek, if you want to jump in at any time, please do. I'm just trying to get as much of Charlie's brain into this conversation as possible. And Charlie, to follow up on this question about what China means for all this, Ben Ziff, who is with the State Department, but right now is a fellow here at GMF, says, Charlie, can we step back politically and militarily, yet remain as economically preponderant as we have been in the post-war years? Don't they go hand in hand? And he is thinking of this challenge of China when he's asking this question.
I'll make 2 points. First, I do think that the first order of business is to reinstate American leadership politically, in the sense that even though the founders were hardcore isolationists when it meant avoiding entanglement in European politics or getting involved outside North America, they were ardent and passionate about setting the United States up as a model for the world. And it seems to me that on balance, the United States has tilted history in a right direction over the course of its history, whether or not it's engaging abroad. And we need to get back in that game. We're not in that game right now. And so should Biden win, I would say the first order of business is get the lights functioning again, get our Democratic House in order, rebuild solidarity with our Democratic allies, because in a world in which China and Russia are pushing back against liberal democratic norms, we need to reestablish our voice and our model on that front. Economically, I think that again, going back to the founders, they were ardent traders. The US military did range widely in the 19th century, but only to protect American commerce. I think that we are heading into a world in which the United States will not be as preponderant economically as it's been. And that's because China will soon be the largest economy in the world. That's going to change the world. And that's one of the reasons that I think we can't go back to Eisenhower, or we can't go back to the 1990s. And that's because banking on our relationships with the liberal democracies won't be enough. We don't constitute 80% of GDP anymore. We constitute about 45% of GDP. And so we're going to have to, even as we reinvest in a democratic alliance, democratic community, figure out how to manage commercially and otherwise a world in which the largest economy in the world is not a democracy.
So Charlie, we have a question from Stefano Stefanini, who is one of Italy's most accomplished former diplomats. He's now with the Atlantic Council, and he wants to ask you the following question. All European diplomats who serve in the US, as I did for nearly 14 years, get exposed to a mix of strands: exceptionalism, activism, isolationism, globalism, and it's difficult to disentangle those. To simplify to the extreme, would you agree that the United States often thinks isolationist, but acts globalist?
Very good question, Stefano. I wish that I could see you, preferably in person, but at least on the screen. It's nice to hear from you via Zoom. I think that has been the default position of late, and that we live in a world in which everybody is used to the United States sending out the fire trucks when a blaze breaks out. Either a geopolitical blaze or a financial blaze. We write the checks, we do the bailout, we manage the IMF, we have credit default swaps with the European Union. I'm not sure that's going to be the case anymore. And I think what we're witnessing is a world in which there will be probably a serious under-provision of public goods. And to some extent, I think we are seeing the results of a vacuum of sorts in Libya, in the Eastern Med, in Syria, in Nagorno-Karabakh. And that's kind of the world that we're headed into. One of the things I find most troubling about the Trump presidency in America First is that even though I support his effort to right size, even though I do think that we should generally end the forever wars in the Middle East, if we do that, we need to wed it to a diplomatic strategy where we get our friends and allies to do more, to chip in more, not alienate them, but to build new functional, efficient coalitions with them. And so I do think we're headed into a period in which that kind of default global engagement that many around the world are used to from the United States is going to be harder to come by. We need to prepare the world for that and find ways to help fill the under-provision of public goods.
So Charlie, I'm going to combine two questions because we have one from Kaz Yost, who is saying, Charlie, talk more about the role presidential leadership and experience plays in US engagement abroad. And Biden would be the most qualified internationalist president since Bush 41. Would having an internationalist in the White House affect the potential future for the US? And I want to combine that with a question from Johannes Allefeld, who says, talking about the mantra of 1940, what could be a Pearl Harbor-like moment that would trigger the US public to reorient itself toward international engagement and support of the multilateral order? So Charlie, as you think about this, what is the role that presidents or individuals play versus the role of events outside of US borders? Over to you.
Great questions. So to Kaz, having worked with Joe Biden on an almost daily basis for close to 3 years, I can say comfortably that you're not going to find anybody who's a bigger Atlanticist. He was constantly going to Ukraine. He went to the Balkans. He firm believer in NATO. Thomas, you can breathe more comfortably knowing that Joe Biden would be in the Oval Office if he wins, because he really believes in the Atlantic space. And he's also an internationalist, but a pragmatist. I don't think he or President Obama were particularly ideological. They were problem solvers. And I think that's a good thing. But I do believe that it's important not to think in terms of restoration. That is to say, we could just go back to the pre-Trump era and operate according to the rules and procedures that we had before, because I don't think that's going to work, right? The country has changed a lot. The world has changed a lot. President Biden, if he takes office, will have to focus like a laser on the domestic issues, getting our democratic system functioning, dealing with a polarized electorate. The pandemic is probably priority number one because the world and the country can't reopen without solving the pandemic. So I do think there will be less time and energy and money for foreign affairs than there was before. The second point I would make is that I think we need to think in terms of a reallocation of resources. One thing that we have learned over the last few years is that cyber threats, climate change, pandemic and global health, they threaten us a lot more than traditional military threats. So maybe we should start investing in those kind of non-traditional issues and less of a militarized foreign policy, much more on the diplomatic front, trying to repair a State Department that has been woefully hollowed out over the last 3+ years. On the question of events, I think it is a combination of leadership and events. As I think I said in response to Nora's question, to me, China is in some ways the issue, the threat, the external peer competitor that will keep the United States very engaged in the world, at least in the Pacific. And in that respect, the external environment and the internal environment are in a constant feedback loop with each other. But I do think that one of the top priorities of the next president is to make sure that there is a rebuilding of the domestic consensus behind foreign engagement. And here I agree very much with what Derek said, which is the American president needs to make the case to the American people about why the world matters, why we need trade, why we need to fight climate change together, why we need international institutions. I think the president will find the American public a willing partner, but that task has to be front and center right now, because I really do believe that at this point, American foreign policy has become politically insolvent, and the American public is quite confused about our role in the world. And that's one of the reasons, in my mind, that this isolationist impulse has been gaining traction.
Super. And I'm mindful of the time, and I'm going to apologize to all of the listeners who have fantastic questions in the queue. But I want to give Thomas and Derek an opportunity just to share some of their closing thoughts. And then, Charlie, I'm going to give you the final word. But Thomas, let me come to you first.
In closing, all of the discussion, Charlie, about where things stand and what the options for the future are ring true from Europe as well. But I do want to make one point and put a question mark into something that you have said just a minute ago, and that is, especially referring to the Middle East, I think, that the goal of American foreign policy must be to get allies to do more where America does less, because otherwise you'll have you have a lack of provision of public goods. I would go, I think, even a little further. It is very unlikely if America retrenches that others will step in, because they live in the same world. They will have to count the same world that America lives in. If they've been allied with America, they also have forever wars and forever engagements. We've all been in Afghanistan for more than a decade, nearly 2 decades. So I think the same impulses of retrenching rather than taking over from America are going to be here, certainly in Europe, and already there. You can see it in Great Britain, you can see it in France, you can see it here. So that the question then becomes, can we live with spaces of less security and less influence where we are able to change the needle? I think that is a big question, not only to keep up international engagement, but also to live with the fact that there are areas or moments out of our influence.
Great. Derek, closing thought from you?
Sure. And Charlie, really briefly, just on Thomas's question, as Charlie, as you know, and Karen and I both experienced too, one of President Obama's greatest frustrations was the expectation that European partners in particular would do more in a place like Libya after the 2011 air campaign. That didn't turn out that way. And I think that kind of reframed for him how to think about problems like Syria and what one can realistically expect from other countries. This also brings to mind this idea that I think perhaps one of the more positive things from this current moment we're living through is just a greater sense of humility and frankly, sobriety about what can be accomplished, and that there are certain problems that can't be solved, and that, like doctors dealing with chronic conditions that they can't cure, but they rather will find a way to mitigate the worst effects or find a way to buy time until something else comes about, that perhaps that's on certain problems, that's the best we can do. And the willingness to accept that is probably a key part of what needs to happen in the foreign policy debate. I want to end with a question, though, just as a very quick one, is what surprised you the most with writing this book? You know, this is a journey that started several years ago, interrupted by service in the Obama administration, completed during the Trump years. Like, during this deep historical journey you've been on, what kind of was the thing you either clarified or just you were surprised by?
Sure. On the question of allies doing more, Derek, you're 100% right to point out that President Obama was quite sensitive to the question of, are you chipping in? And I think one of the reasons that he went into Libya, I wasn't there at the time, I'm guessing he did so kind of reluctantly, was because others were saying, we're going to do the lion's share of the heavy lifting.
Well, more than that, they were saying, we're going to do it with or without you, right?
And then when it came to Syria, he would say, okay, what are you going to do? Mr. Erdogan, Chancellor Merkel, what are you going to chip in? And they would sort of, shuffle away. And then when it came, let's say, to enhanced forward presence on the eastern flank of NATO, he would say, yeah, I'm sure, as long as the others are willing to do this. And so that, to me, is an indicator of where we're going to be moving forward. People have to pony up. People have to put their chips on the table. And if they do, I think the United States will also carry its burden. But the American people want to know that others are doing their fair share. That does mean, to be blunt, that I do think we're going to end up in a world that is sort of what Thomas describes, which is that problems go unmet, and that fires will break out and nobody puts them out, and we're going to kind of have to live with the consequences of that. But I do think that we need to develop a toolkit of non-military responses to these kinds of problems, long-term issues, investment, job creation, educating women, fighting global pandemics early on, because in many respects, we end up with wars and instability and refugee flows because we don't take those non-military steps early enough. And as I said, I think American foreign policy has to some extent been over-militarized, and we need to develop these other aspects, put them in our portfolio. Finally, it's a great question, Derek. And I'll answer it this way, that when I started to go back and just read American diplomatic history, my first reaction was, what country am I reading about? Is this, because it just was unrecognizable. And that's because, as I said, I went to grad school in the 80s. I started teaching before the Berlin Wall went down. And we generally are very familiar with post-Pearl Harbor America and post-Pearl Harbor grand strategy. And grand strategy in America changed fundamentally on December 7, 1941. And when I was reading what it was like in the 1780s and the 19th century and the 20s and the 30s, I literally was like in shock. And that's part of the reason I wanted to tell this story. I think Americans need to know that. And then the other thing that surprised me, particularly after Trump took office, is the degree to which his America First stuff resonated with what I had been reading, right? The isolation, the protectionism, the nativism, the unilateralism, they were all so much a part of the nation's history prior to Pearl Harbor. I don't think Trump reads a lot of American history, but I do think that he is tapping into a part of the American experience that is there. And that's part of the reason that I wanted to say, hey, let's not assume that this isolationist impulse is gone for good. Let's not pretend that we don't need to worry about it. And I would remind everyone that when McKinley launched the war in 1898, he never thought the isolationists would make a comeback. When Woodrow Wilson went to war in 1917 and then launched the League of Nations, he couldn't have imagined what happened in the 20s and 30s. So there is this impulse in the United States. We need to take it seriously. We need to understand its good bits and its bad bits and craft moving forward a new level of global engagement, a new kind of global engagement that again enjoys the support of the American public.
Charlie, thanks so much. There are so many wonderful things about your book. When I think about books in general, they can teach you about things you don't know about, and sometimes they can lead you to think differently about things you thought you did know about. And your book did both of those things and so much more. So thank you for writing it. Thank you for being so generous with your time this morning and joining us here at GMF in this conversation. And I will leave on the happy note that I hope you will sell lots of copies of this book. So congratulations to you, Charlie. Thanks to everyone who tuned in for this session. Thanks to Thomas and Derek. And with that, hope everybody has a wonderful weekend.
Thank you so much, Karen. It's been a great discussion.
Bye-bye.